Welcome back to our Epochs podcast. This is episode 4, Darwin's Voyage on the Beagle, Evidence Before the Theory. Today we explore one central question. What observations from the Beagle voyage shaped Darwin's thinking about evolution? Let's begin.
It's the origin story everyone thinks they know, but the reality is it's so much messier, much more chaotic, and frankly just far more interesting than the legend.
We always get the sanitized version, don't we? Charles Darwin standing heroically on the ship, he sees a finch, and boom, the theory of evolution just appears in his head.
Right, but when you look at the actual timeline, that's just not it at all. He didn't step onto that boat as some kind of revolutionary thinker.
Far from it.
In 1831, Charles Darwin was a creationist. He was, 22 years old, an amateur naturalist, and he was actually in training to be a parson.
So he believed what everyone else believed.
Pretty much. He believed in the fixity of species, the idea that, animals were created exactly as they are, put in their specific places by a divine hand, and they hadn't changed one bit since the beginning.
And that context is so important because it means the story of the Beagle isn't about a man trying to prove his theory. It's about the slow and probably painful dismantling of his entire worldview.
Exactly. He was just seeing things that simply shouldn't exist if the world was static.
Yeah.
And it all started with a mission that had basically nothing to do with biology.
Right. The HMS Beagle wasn't a research vessel.
No, it was a tool of the British Empire. This was about mapping.
A survey expedition.
Purely. The British Admiralty needed better maps of South America. They wanted to make sure their merchant ships stopped crashing into rocks. Darwin wasn't even the official naturalist.
He was the gentleman companion to Captain Robert Fitzroy, which is a concept that just blows my mind.
I know. He was basically brought along so the captain wouldn't get too lonely and depressed on a long voyage.
And Darwin was horribly seasick the whole time.
Violently seasick. For 5 years. So every single time the Beagle anchored to do its survey work, Darwin was desperate to get off that boat. And that's where the first crack in the whole fixity of species idea really appeared.
Which brings us to Argentina, the Pampas. This is early on, right? Around 1832.
Yes. He gets on land, and he essentially becomes a fossil hunter. He starts digging at sites like Punta Alta and Monte Hermoso.
And finding fossils wasn't new. People had found big bones before.
Of course. But what Darwin found was, it was specific and it was confusing. He started unearthing these absolute giants. We're talking about the Megatherium.
Which is basically a ground sloth, but the size of an elephant.
Right. Just imagine a sloth big enough to peer into a second-story window. And then he found the Toxodon. He had a hard time even describing it. He called it a gigantic rodent, sort of like a hippo with the face of a rat.
I love that he actually bought a Toxodon skull from a local rancher for just a few shillings. It just shows how frontier the science was.
It does. But the real aha moment wasn't just that the bones were big. It was about what they look like.
The family resemblance.
That's the crucial part. He's looking at these fossils, the giant sloth, the armored glyptodonts that were like armadillos the size of a small car, and then he looks down at the animals literally running around his feet.
And he sees living small sloths. He sees living small armadillos.
The resemblance was just striking, and this led him to this idea he called the law of succession of types. It's this observation that in any given area, the extinct animals look like giant versions of the living animals.
Which seems so obvious to us now because we get Ancestry. But if you're in 1832, that's a huge problem. If species were created perfectly for an environment, why would you replace a giant sloth with a tiny one?
Exactly. Why not replace with an antelope or something completely different? It suggested this biological continuity, like the current animals were the great-great-grandchildren of the extinct ones.
Okay, so he's got a link. But for one species to turn into another, you need time, a lot of time.
Massive amounts of time. And that brings us to the geology, which you could argue was more important to his early thinking than even the biology. He had brought a book with him, Charles Lyell's Principles of Geology.
The idea of deep time.
Yes, that the Earth was shaped by slow, gradual processes over millions of years, not sudden catastrophes. But reading about it is one thing.
Seeing it happen is another.
And he did. In February 1835, he was in Valdivia, Chile, when a massive earthquake hit, destroyed the city. But while everyone else was dealing with the chaos, Darwin did what he always did. He ran down to the coast to see what happened.
And he found the proof.
He found huge beds of mussels attached to the rocks, now sitting feet above the high tide line. They were dead, just rotting in the sun. The land itself had physically jumped up.
Wow.
And he looked at that small jump and then looked up at the Andes Mountains behind him. And it all clicked.
If you have enough of those little jumps over enough time.
You don't just get a dry mussel bed. You get the Andes. He'd even found fossilized seashells thousands of feet up in the mountains. This was the proof he needed that the world was incredibly old and constantly changing.
So that gives him the timeline. The stage is old enough for the drama of evolution to play out.
It gave him a framework. Gradualism. If the Earth changes slowly, maybe life changes slowly too. He even used this logic to solve another mystery before he saw the evidence coral reefs.
This part of his work is amazing. It shows him thinking like a physicist, almost. He basically built a model in his head.
He did. He reasoned that if the Andes are rising, then somewhere else, the ocean floor must be sinking to balance it out, probably in the Pacific. So he asked himself, okay, what happens to a volcanic island that's on a sinking piece of crust?
The coral that lives around the edge has to keep growing upwards to stay near the sunlight.
Precisely. The island slowly sinks, but the coral builds a tower. Eventually, the volcano is gone, completely underwater, and all you're left with is a ring of coral, an atoll.
A perfect metaphor for evolution, really. Tiny changes over a long time create a massive result.
Exactly.
So he has the timeline. He has the link between past and present species. But there's a third piece of the puzzle from the voyage, one that's, well, it's pretty uncomfortable, but it was pivotal for his thinking about our own species.
The Fuegians.
Yeah, the story of Jemmy Button.
This is a part that often gets left out, but it's critical. On a previous trip, Captain Fitzroy he'd taken 3 indigenous people from Tierra del Fuego.
The very tip of South America.
Right, and he brought them to England, had them educated, taught English, dressed in suits, converted to Christianity.
So when Darwin meets Jemmy Button on the Beagle, he's this polite, English-speaking young man who's worried about keeping his gloves clean.
In Darwin's eyes, he was civilized. But the whole point of this part of the voyage was to return them home. And when they arrived in Tierra del Fuego, Darwin saw Jemmy's relatives on the shore. And he was just utterly horrified.
It was a culture shock of the highest order.
He saw people who, to him, seemed savage, naked in the freezing cold, aggressive. The contrast between Jemmy on the deck and the people on the shore was it was overwhelming for him. He wrote that the difference was greater than that between a wild and a domesticated animal.
Which sounds incredibly harsh, and it definitely reflects his Victorian prejudices. But the scientific conclusion he drew was, it was actually the opposite of what most people would have thought then.
It was. The popular theory at the time was polygenism, that different races were different species, created separately. Darwin rejected that completely. He looked at Jemmy, who could function in London high society, and at the people on the shore, and realized they were biologically identical.
The only difference was culture, environment, habit, he called it.
Exactly. It proved to him that humans are a single, incredibly plastic species. We're not fixed. And this really connects back to his family. The Darwins and the Wedgwoods were passionate abolitionists.
The Am I Not a Man and a Brother? Anti-slavery medallion.
Produced by his grandfather-in-law. So this experience proved to him that all humans are one family. And if all humans are one family despite looking so different, then maybe all mammals are one family. It cleared a huge mental block.
Okay, we have to sail north now to the Galapagos. But I want to tread carefully here because the Eureka myth is probably strongest on these islands.
The myth of the finch.
Right. The story that Darwin lands, sees all the different beaks, and instantly understands natural selection.
It's total fiction. The truth is, he kind of messed up the finches. He shot a bunch of them, tossed them all into one bag, and didn't even label which island they came from. He thought they were a mix of blackbirds and wrens.
So he didn't even realize their significance until later.
Not until he got back to London, and an expert ornithologist named John Gould had to set him straight. The finches were a retrospective discovery.
So what was the real-time clue? What did he actually notice while he was there?
The mockingbirds.
The mockingbirds? Really?
Yes. He was much more careful with them. He correctly labeled them by island. And he noticed that the mockingbirds on Floriana Island were clearly different from the ones on San Cristobal Island.
And this goes back to that problem with the creator, doesn't it? If you're designing a bird for a volcanic island, why make slightly different versions for 2 identical islands just a few miles apart?
It makes no sense. It's redundant. And Darwin realized isolation had to be the key. Birds from the mainland got stranded on different islands, and then they just drifted apart. On the way home, he wrote in his notes that if this was true, it would undermine the stability of species.
Undermine the stability of species. I mean, that's heresy for the
He
1830s.
used dangerous thinking. And the tortoises backed it up. The local governor told him he could tell which island a tortoise came from just by the shape of its shell.
So isolation creates divergence.
Isolation plus adaptation. But there's one last discovery, and it has this touch of dark comedy to it. We have to talk about the rhea.
The dinner plate discovery. This is my favorite story.
So back in Patagonia, Darwin had heard all these rumors from the local gauchos about a smaller, rarer species of rhea, the big ostrich-like bird.
And he looked for it for months. He was obsessed.
He was. And where does he finally find it?
On his dinner plate.
The ship's artist had shot a bird for dinner, the cook roasted it, and Darwin's halfway through the meal when he just freezes. He looks at the bones on his plate and realizes he's eating his discovery.
He was eating the evidence.
He was. Total panic. He jumps up and manages to rescue the head, the neck, some feathers, enough to send back to London. And it was eventually named Rhea darwini.
But besides the amazing story, why was this bird so important?
Because it showed replacement in space. The big common rhea lived in the north. This smaller one lives in the south. So as you moved across the geography, one species replaced another.
Just like the mockingbirds on the different islands.
Exactly. It was yet another blow to the idea that species are fixed and universal. They're local. They're adaptable.
So the Beagle gets back to England in 1836. Darwin is a scientific hero, mainly for his geology, but he has this mountain of evidence. The fossils, the earthquakes, the mockingbirds, the rheas. Why did it take him another 20 years to publish?
Because he had the evidence, but he didn't have the mechanism. He had what he called a chaos of facts. He knew that evolution was happening, but he had no idea how.
He was missing natural selection.
That was the engine. He hadn't built it yet. The voyage gave him all the raw materials, all the bricks, but he had to spend the next 2 decades back in England breeding pigeons and studying barnacles, slowly figuring out how to build a house.
It really reframes the whole scientific process. It wasn't a flash of genius. It was a slow, painful accumulation of uncomfortable facts that eventually forced him to abandon his old beliefs.
That is the key takeaway. Darwin didn't start with a theory and go looking for proof. He started with an observation, a weird bone, a dead muscle, a mockingbird's beak. And he let the data lead him, even when it led somewhere he knew would be dangerous.
It's a lesson in just looking. The world isn't a finished painting. It's a movie that's still playing.
And we are right in the middle of it. The Earth is still rising, islands are still sinking, life is still adapting.
Which leads us to a final thought for you to think about. We've talked about how isolation, being stuck on an island, being separated by a mountain range, is what drives this rapid change. It's how you get new species.
Right. Isolation is the engine of diversity.
But we now live in a world where isolation is effectively dead. You can fly anywhere in 24 hours. We move species from continent to continent on cargo ships. We're mixing everything together. Are we basically stopping that engine of evolution? Or are we creating a new homogenized world where diversity just disappears?
That's a haunting question. If isolation ends, does speciation end? Or does it just change the rules of the game entirely?
Something to mull over. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the voyage of the Beagle. We'll see you next time on Epochs.